So what should we call this? Maybe the Whole City Podcast? I'm Alex Joyner. I'm the pastor at First United Methodist Church here in Charlottesville. Somebody who began his career as a disc jockey and a radio news director. So the opportunity to get behind the microphone again and do some interviews has always appealed to me. And today I want to introduce Elizabeth Catte, who's going to talk with us about history, going to talk about Market Street Park right here in front of the church. We're going to talk about the racial dynamics of the 1920s and how those still linger in our memory and history and in our physical landscape here today. And we're going to talk about her new book, which is called Pure Virginia, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia. So I hope you find this as interesting as I did, and I hope that you will have the opportunity to hear future conversations in months to come as we begin this new experiment. So here is, without further ado, here's this interview with Elizabeth Catte. So I'm here with Elizabeth Catte, and she is brave enough to take an inaugural jump into the waters with me to do a conversation about Charlottesville's history, and particularly as we're thinking about Market Street Park. Elizabeth is a writer and a public historian living in Stanton, author of a great book that helped me get reoriented to Charlottesville before I came back last year. And it's a book called Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern Virginia. And as published by Belt Publishing, came out last year. Elizabeth, what else, anything else you'd like to say about what you're up to these days and who you are?
So I am somebody who is suffering from pandemic brain pretty significantly right now. And so I'm trying to focus on just small projects that are bite-sized, that I can dig into, that have a lot of like elements of grunt work activities and stuff like that. So I'm doing a lot of, digital history projects and things like that, things that have like achievable goals, because I feel that having those just really gets me through some of the lethargy that's still hanging over our heads, obviously from what's been going on for us for the last 2 years.
Yes, I know all about that too. It feels like molasses a lot of the time, so I understand. Yeah. Well, I really this book is such a great book, and it's got
Thanks.
such a great tone to it, because it's I appreciate all kinds of writing that have a good sense of place, and yours really has that, but it also has fire and humor too. So I appreciate both of those qualities to it too. So thank you for it.
Thank you.
What made you want to write a book about eugenics?
So to answer that, I have to tell you a little bit about Stanton, which is where I live over the mountain from you. Stanton is an old community, but a small community. It's about 24,000 people in the heart of the Shenandoah Valley. And about 10 years ago, Stanton embarked on this ambitious project to expand the core of its downtown area. The downtown area is really the crown jewel of Stanton through the efforts of past historic preservationists and community developers in the present. It's emerged as this what we call like a Main Street America program. So a place where people can go and just have a great time relaxing, eating lunch, things like that. And 10 years ago, enfolded into sort of that spirit of community development was a campus of buildings that were once attached to Western State Hospital. Western State Hospital still exists. It's in more modern facilities, and the original buildings were transferred to a developer with a vision to transform the site into accommodation, so properties for sale, into a hotel, convention center, conference center, future opportunities for more accommodation, restaurants, breweries, that kind of thing. So it was a big deal. And so in that process, the history of the buildings, the history of the institution, Western State Institution, which is eventually became one of 6 public facilities for the treatment of mental illness in Virginia, over 200 years old, its history became part of its branding identity. And that was a really interesting transformation.
Yeah, that's a long stretch to pull those two together.
Yeah, so 200 years of history had to get condensed into something that could be about 2 paragraphs on a website, and could also be anchored to, branding material for tourism, for community development. So it developed this really kind of cozy, positive story about early physicians who committed themselves to the humane treatment of people with mental illnesses. And that was certainly one of the chapters of that site's history. But the larger chapter in the chapter that I knew as a historian was the history of that institution during the eugenics era. So after 1927 until about 1970, over at least 1,700 people were sterilized against their will at Western State Hospital. The longest serving superintendent was a vocal leader of the Virginia eugenics movement. And it has a very harrowing history in that context. And it was the context I knew as a historian doing the history of gender, the history of sexuality. And so it kind of caused this whiplash for me when I was living through that moment of transformation. And what was striking about that whiplash is it, struck home to me how difficult it is to incorporate stories about disability, of which eugenics is a small piece of, into larger community history. So how do we tell the stories of disability within stories where we talk about who we are as a community? When you don't often find the history of disability in the history of other topics. So for instance, how people work in my community, how people work, how land use, what's the history of land use in the community. So it's really hard to incorporate histories like eugenics and disabilities into right. Stories that kind of generate broader community conversations. I personally think. So the challenge for writing a history of eugenics was to, peel back the layers on that institution a little bit and tell stories that had become a little bit marginalized towards rebranding this institution. But also the big challenge was trying to find a way to claim disability history and the history of eugenics as community history, and to do that in a way that would help people learn something new about, the world around them.
And okay, so I've got two things. One is first, could you give me like a thumbnail definition of eugenics? I realized we'd started out just kind of jumping into that, but it's I'd be interested in how you define it. Yeah.
Eugenics is a set of real world practices, but also a philosophy designed to breed better humans. There are different strategies that have been employed towards achieving the goal of eugenics. Some we call positive strategies or positive eugenics. So that means making incentives or different kinds of encouragement for people who have good genes to reproduce and thus improve the human population. But we also, particularly in the United States, but also in Germany, have a history of negative eugenics, which is methods to restrict the population and to restrict the reproduction of people who society feels are undesirable. So disabled people, but often non-white people, poor people, immigrants are sort of like the group that keeps getting lumped together in the story of negative eugenics. And so the story of eugenics is a story about trying to engineer the human population, but also is attached to this very subjective idea about the public good. And so when we talk about public good in the 1920s, we're talking about a public good that was very much attached to what white people, and particularly middle and upper class white people, how they thought society should work. Right.
Right. And when I hear the word eugenics, because of the way I was brought up, the first thing I think of is Nazi experimentation. Mm-hmm. But what your book makes clear is that was a really widespread intellectual movement of a kind that had an impact here as well. And you can still see the physical evidence.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Many different varieties of eugenics. It's not just a story about a particular time period, although I'd study a particular time period, but it is a pseudoscience with far-reaching consequences and a long history that spans many localities, many countries. And, we're still learning about, constantly.
Right. And so there's that, and then you also have such a strong sense of the physical legacy that's left over, the built environment that was around it. And you describe Western State in a way that I can picture it, and you do the same with the Market Street Park and the other places that you're talking about in this book. How did place get to be so important to you?
I think place for me, is such a good foundation for engaging with the past. Many people have what we would call a strong sense of place. So in that sense of place is in turn connected to their emotional senses. And this means I think that you have the potential to reach people in a really multi-layered way. When you anchor narratives to place, you're effectively asking them to inhabit a space alongside you, to step into a world with you. And personally, that's a writing personality that works well for me, this sort of, empathetic guide. So it plays to my advantages as a writer and a historian. But more broadly, I think that place and space is an arena where big debates get played out. So what is the public good? What kind of entitlements are at work in our community? Who has a right to a public life? So there's a potential to build towards these very big, intense conversations, but also do so in a way that has the potential to change the way that people see their communities, change the way they what they think about when they're going about their daily life. It could interrupt their routines or give them a new perspective on things that they do every day or places where they grew up. And again, that's appealing to many different kinds of senses, not just sort of intellectual curiosity, but this deeper emotional level that I think people connect with. And connecting and triggering and firing their emotions, I think is it's an under-respected tool of the historian, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's and that certainly comes through in what you've written. Well, can I ask you to read us a little bit of the book? And I'm particularly interested, of course, being pastor at First United Methodist Church. We were right on the square that was at the center of all of the where the Robert E. Lee statue was, that in 2017 became the focus of the Unite the Right rally and all the events surrounding that. But you've got you take us back to when that statue was unveiled, and so at the beginning of chapter 2, if you could just read us a little bit from that section, give us a sense of that history.
Yeah, of course. So the first chapter of my book about eugenics is really situating eugenics and its connection to medical history, the new ideas about disease and illness that flow through eugenics. But eugenics also brought a new language to talk about race in the United States. And so chapter 2 is a way of sort of probing that side of eugenics. And it begins for me in this local story with a story about the day, the ceremony to dedicate the statue of Robert E. Lee. So on a sunny day in May in 1924, white Virginia gathered in Charlottesville to celebrate a monumentous occasion for the New South. This South was no longer a fragile thing hiding in the shame of the past, but a living, breathing modern enterprise that had been secured through an alliance of law, science, education, and above all, power. After the Civil War, white Southern leaders had suffered the indignity of an arranged marriage. In their eyes, they had swallowed their traditions to be hesitant brides, wedded to a disapproving nation. In the intervening decades since the war's end, however, new economies, industries, and institutions helped these visionaries win back the right to claim their own heritage. They were careful to wrap this past in the veneer of future progress in order to achieve what many, even in the North, agreed was a pleasing balance. On that day in May, at least 25,000 people pushed out from the campus of the University of Virginia and set a raucous, cheerful course towards downtown. The city's daily progress called it the greatest procession which ever threaded the streets of Charlottesville. Military bands, cadets, and soldiers from all corners of the state lent a ceremonial atmosphere to the festivities, and many local businesses had closed for the day. The most honored guest of all was there only in spirit, hiding in bronze under the shroud of a Confederate flag, but his youngest descendant, a 3-year-old named Mary, took over the day's important duties to the best of her ability. Holding a rope, standing tall, receiving cheers, it was the South distilled in a single moment, delicate life blushing in respectful awe of a rich legacy, an embodied promise built from the bloodline. A more terrifying but no less grotesque kind of pageantry had built to the day of celebration. Just 3 days prior, The Ku Klux Klan had made their own parade down Main Street, claiming, testing, and expanding the boundaries of this carefully selected gathering place, doing the work that money alone, the very buying of a city, could not achieve. The paper reported thousands lined the sidewalks of Main Street from the C&O station to the foot of Vinegar Hill. Ah, Vinegar Hill, the place where Black Charlottesville thrived. Soon, this part of the city would no longer be a threshold, a portal between the worlds of Black and white citizens. It would be a space reserved for white Charlottesville alone.
Great. Yeah, that's quite a scene. I'm trying to imagine 25,000 people and today in a procession in Charlottesville. That would be humongous. So
it's possible that it's also possible that reports exaggerated the numbers of the actual crowds.
No, surely not. Oh, well,
but it wasn't. It was a large crowd, and people came from all over the state to participate.
Right. So it did have a significance beyond Charlottesville too. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. So I got here to Charlottesville just in time for the removal of that statue last July. And on the day that it happened, there was another large crowd gathered around the park, and we stood on the steps of this church facing the park, and we're singing songs like Eyes on the Prize and things like that. But we're also doing some readings associated with it. And so I read that section you just read as part of our day, just to be a witness to what the first day was like and what that day was like. So what do you think the park itself, which was taking shape and all the buildings around it really during that period, what did it say about Charlottesville at that time?
So first of all, I'm really moved that you did that, and just so honored to have part of my work there in spirit on that day. The reason I wrote about that moment in a book about eugenics, which might seem at first disconnected from the broader sort of like these celebrations and pageantries, is because it was important for me to include, because I think moments like that capture what I think is one of like the quintessential misdirections of the time period. And, that is the idea that the future wouldn't look like the past, that we were marching towards something different, towards the people in Charlottesville, and the city of Charlottesville itself was marching towards, an era of future progress. And this is really easy to see in the eugenics movement, because there's an array of scientific language pointing towards, for example, the affirmation of racist beliefs. It's, the language of the future, but it's really there to validate the past and validate the existing social order. But that misdirection also looks like, in my view, the 1924 ceremony. The event itself is steeped in lost cause mythologies, and the readings and flavors of lost cause mythology vary, but most tellings claim the moral innocence of white Southerners during the Civil War and during enslavement. So lost cause mythology pretends, it misdirects, it says that through the passage of time, through some of the heat running out of our relationships to one another, that white Southerners are now allowed to kind of claim their heritage back, that they're allowed to dignify their leaders and ancestors. They're allowed the dignity of remembrance and honor, to benign honor, when really it was an attempt to buttress a world order that looked a lot like the past. There's also misdirections at the corner of the story that I find really interesting, that, it was important for me to at least allude to in that passage. The one that I just read about was the Ku Klux Klan parades that had taken place in the city prior to the statue unveiling. Right. At least 3 days of Ku Klux Klan parades, that summer, the summer of dedication. And so when people like Edwin Alderman, the president of the University of Virginia, all the city leaders, faculty from the University of Virginia, the leaders of local organizations, when they gather in Charlottesville to unveil the statue, what they're promising is that the future will have a certain dignity to it, that it won't be a violent enterprise, that it will be, that there is a social order to be achieved, but it won't be done through violence. it won't be done through repression, that it is, going to be a really rational, ordered enterprise. And that's certainly not true, because that the testing and priming of that space was conducted through the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the ways that they terrorized Black Charlottesville ahead of those events, and historically long before that day, as well. So again, I just think I'm just really fascinated by sort of all the misdirection happening at this time period, and the way that it promised an illusion to the people of Charlottesville. And I think that that sense of illusion is something that Charlottesville has become particularly good at. The idea of an ordered, progressive, even liberal city, that that doesn't have room for violence. I mean, we heard that a lot during the days of the Unite the Right, that this is not a place. This is not a place of violence. Those days that we are not those people. But really, this destabilization has occurred in many other ways, through things like zoning, through things like racist educational policies, through urban renewal. And so a story about the monument's unveiling and what it was meant to convey, but what was lurking in the background is a really fascinating story for me.
Yeah, so this is maybe a little aside, but as you say that, I'm thinking about the fact that how much of those stories run through each one of us who grew up around here. I grew up close by in a little town called Orange, and that myth of the lost cause was part of how I was kind of trained to claim an identity as a Southern boy, a white boy. So it was clearly effective, but I recognize in myself that conflict, that sense of having two narratives, a progressive narrative and this old narrative, and how they work together and didn't work together. So now, you say a little bit later in that chapter, when I find myself near the statue of Robert E. Lee now, I'm forced to concede that the physical world that white leaders of the past hoped would endure, in fact, did. So you obviously wrote that before the statue removal, but how do you feel looking at that space now? What is how does that space speak now, do you think?
There's lots of potential for that space, and I've tried to keep up with developments, not just in Charlottesville, but also in Richmond, with the way that space has been reclaimed by the community, and sort of like the creation of the organic creation of Mark Xavier Peters Park, and the way the ad hoc and community-based sort of drawings, performances, and how the community has filled that space. But I do have to say that the fact of the removal of the statues, I think for me, doesn't change the truth of that statement that the world endured, because I wasn't just thinking about, the statues. I was thinking about the downtown mall, the wider community. I was thinking about the fact that, not far from those statues, was the historic community of Vinegar Hill, incorporated into Charlottesville, I think in the 1830s, and slated for removal by the city of Charlottesville in the 1960s as part of a racist urban renewal scheme. And if anybody needs a landmark for that, I think the most recognizable one is where the Omni Hotel sits today. So I was thinking about urban renewal. I was thinking about gentrification. I was thinking a lot about the experiences of unhoused people on the downtown mall, and so those used to be pretty close to home for me, because my partner was a librarian at the downtown public library in Charlottesville, and many of their guests were unhoused people, and sort of the reality that they experienced, using the park for shelter, during all this time of potential violence and unrest and uncertainty, and how sometimes the larger downtown business community treats those individuals as a nuisance, rather than neighbors, community members. And so those were the things that I was thinking of as well when I made that statement. The artifacts and the endurance of those ideas connect to the events of 1924, connect to the placement of the Robert E. Lee statue, connect to the laws that enshrine eugenics. And I think it's important to keep in mind too that, eugenics is about kind of these pseudoscientific ideas, and it definitely has particular agendas and strategies, but it's also about denying somebody the right to public life. Eugenics is about elimination, but it can also be about, I personally think, a spiritual death as well, and telling somebody that their ultimate value is when they go away, when they die, when their bloodline dies. And so I think that those sentiments are still alive, not just in Charlottesville, obviously lots of other places, but as a physical monument to that world, I think the downtown mall is kind of brilliant because it's a space controlled by primarily upper middle class white people, and that sort of position has been sustained by racist statues, myths, racist urban renewal schemes, and so that endures. And correcting some of that damage will be a citywide effort.
So yeah, removing one statue doesn't change the
Sure.
or two or three. It doesn't change the
no.
the whole picture.
I'm thrilled that the statues are gone. I see no value in their continued placement. Not even this sort of like counter-educational potential that some people have floated. Get rid of them. I mean, that's what I think. But at the same time, there's the history of those statues is the history of a community's decision to exclude and to repress Black people in the community, and so that can't be undone just by these long overdue actions and important actions, but still singular actions.
Right. So you do work with institutions to tell their stories in new ways and to look at their history in new ways. How does that kind of work help us grapple with the past and look to a different future?
So one of the things that I try to keep in mind when embarking on projects that the community will be engaged with from almost the start is that everyone comes to the past with a different set of questions, and everybody comes to the past with different needs. So sometimes the boundaries and needs are going to be obvious. So I like architectural history. You might you might like social history. So there's ways that those can always like rub side by side and reveal different dimensions of the stories. And I'll go ahead and give you a tip that if somebody is really enthusiastic for one particular flavor of history, then you might have found yourself a committed volunteer to be to take on some important duties in your projects. But you do have to talk to people and find out what their needs are. What questions do you want to be answered? So sometimes, again, they're subjective or practical about different eras, different times, different facets of history, but sometimes they're more subjective, and these are the really interesting ones to me. So you might find people who might say, well, what was your church like for people like me in the past? What were those experiences like? What was going on in the church when the 1924 laws were put into place? Was there any kind of discussion, objection, support of those laws? And gradually over time, you do build towards something really fascinating that is history from the bottom up, which is history that is built between collaboration of people in the community that you want to serve, by respecting and by respecting and collaborating on the different needs that each one of you has for the past and the different sets of questions that you want to come to the table with. For your project and the way that you're looking at your history, I think that generally speaking, I don't know if I agree with this idea that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. With much respect to this,
that's been tested a lot recently,
right? With much respect to the speaker, I do not think, at least I do not get the sense that that is the best way to tell history, because in my profession, in my field, what we often see with community projects is that people want to tell a progressive story. Things were bad in the past and we made them better. Right. And that's not always the case. And that can sometimes lead to bigger disappointments than just revealing sort of uncomfortable truths about the past. Sometimes the past is just flat. Sometimes the past is just something you have to sit with and understand and pull apart and revisit and come back to. It's a deep reservoir to drink from, and it can't be forced into a pleasing narrative oftentimes. And so that's my word of caution about trying to tell complex stories about institutions and communities over time, is to let your questions guide you, let the material you have available to tell those stories guide you, to keep the people involved in the project in the loop, and be prepared to sort of reevaluate your thoughts pretty often.
Yeah, we like narratives that have clear heroes and villains, and most of us are very complex and have both within us. So yeah,
definitely. There's, I definitely think that there's some limits to the way, limits to the telling of history. If you want to be understanding that the past, there's contingencies in the past, that nothing was guaranteed, that there's complexity in the past, and people had different ideas in the past, and just because their ideas look different than the ideas you have today, doesn't necessarily imply a moral value. But I definitely think there's limits. And so the other piece of advice I would give is, it's not a bad thing to have some limits. In my book, I talk pretty explicitly about not using men of the time excuses when I talk about some of the historical figures.
Yes.
And so that, more than anything, those discussions can lead to productive exchanges, but I also kind of think that they ultimately are a bigger risk of being distractions to your projects.
Right. Well, another by putting all of these figures within that bigger story of the ideas that they were swimming in, the culture they were swimming in, the places that they were exposed to, you take it away from being just about the individuals too. But in Christian terms, I think that takes the focus from individual sins to the larger sin that is the ocean we swim in. Yeah. So you have heard about the Swords into Plowshares project. The Jefferson School here ended up putting in a bid to the city to receive the old statue of Lee, and is in the process of turning that into art. They just finished a phase of their fundraising campaign to do that. That's an effort to kind of take a historic artifact and to repurpose it to do something new with it. How do you view a project like that?
Fantastic. I think the world of some of the work that's coming out of the Jefferson School, that's being led by Andrea Douglas and Jelaine Schmidt and some of the associates that they have working on these really important projects. I also know that they're doing something about georeferencing property records to better study racist covenants and gentrification and things like that. These are all, incredibly important, practical, but also aspirational projects for the community. And this is the project that they want, and that sounds great to me. Phenomenal. I think that there's a bit of history of this, and outside of the United States. I think that was, again, I spoke about Richmond and sort of reclaiming space in some way, or reclaiming objects, has been a big part of plans for the former area of Monument Row in Richmond as well. And so I think it's fantastic. And I'm interested to see what kind of ideas they come for. Also want to give, this is a good time to give a shout out to all the people who did work on this topic for the last 5 or 6 years, since 2015, really. Particularly, there is a commission in Charlottesville. I think the name was like the Blue Ribbon Commission on Memorials in Public
Hmm.
Space, that did a lot of exploratory work and did a lot of hard investigation, and sat there and listened to the community and sort of engaged widely in their respective fields to make recommendations about the disposition of these monuments in a way that the community felt involved in. And when I write stuff that I'm writing, even though it's in a different vein and on different topics, I've been just phenomenally inspired by the work that's been happening in Charlottesville on these topics. It is truly, truly rooted in the community, led by the community. It's on the agenda. It's on, it looks like real projects because of the community. It's getting real funding because of the community. And it is, truly a call that's been answered by a variety of people who have managed to work together quite well towards, these shared goals and shared ambitions for reshaping the future of the city. So to the extent that these projects continue that work, it's fantastic and inspirational to me as a historian.
Right. Well, that just kind of leads me to my next question, which is just about your own interest in these kind of projects. You wrote initially some work on Appalachia and how that region is often terribly misrepresented by the kind of writing that's done about it, or the romanticizing that's done about it. What got you into this work, and what excites you about it still?
I have to tell I became a historian kind of by accident, which is that I did my first set of studies in Latin and classical studies.
Wow.
And I couldn't get into graduate school in the classics. And I guess I didn't want to go in the ministry, no offense, with my Latin background.
My Latin is pretty poor too.
But I was just thinking, what can I do with this? History seemed like a pretty good related career. Of course, I had to jump from like ancient history to modern US American history, but that was okay. But I'm saying that because I think that the two worlds that I inhabited really shared a common intellectual interest for me, which was like the problems of translation. So in my first career, I was taking a language and trying to interpret it according to my modern eyes and make something from it, maybe something beautiful, but making something that was authentic and true to the original intent. And I don't, do something incredibly different as a historian, which is I take sources and I try to kind of put a life and narrative to them in a way that is both authentic to the intent and the time, but also useful to the public today. And so I really like writing, doing this in a very compact way, because I think that today people have very short attention spans for understandable reasons. And I also think that one of the most enjoyable
Sure, America is 150 pages. Is that right? Something like that?
Yeah, exactly. It's a short, and the Appalachia book is short too.
197. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The most enjoyable part for some people, and this was true of me in reading a book or digesting new ideas, is going out and discussing them with other people afterwards. And so I want to help people race to that point where they can have conversations, with their peers, their relatives, friends, classmates, maybe, and be able to do that more efficiently. But I am, just a person who's interested in very large ideas, very big ideas, issues of power, issues of representation, issues of interpretation and translation, and pulling those apart and not just necessarily finding out a deeper story, but showing the public how that works, the process. If you read a book like Pure America in particular, there's lots of what I would call process notes in there. I tell you when I got mad at a source, or where I couldn't, when I went to find information somewhere and couldn't find it, and how that set my mind kind of going in different directions because the sources that were supposed to be there, or the stories that were supposed to be there, weren't there. And so to include more people on that process of, I guess, how the sausage is made in the world of history, in the world of power, in the world of kind of crafting a narrative from these different pieces of the past.
Yeah, that really comes through too. I mean, you're definitely not a stuffy historian sitting in a a dusty library.
Mhm.
And that comes through in your writing too. So how do you see yourself? I mean, I would have said there's some chronicling going on. There's some advocacy going on. There's generally the human reactions to what you're finding out too. Is there you've said a little of this, but what is your role in this writing, do you think?
I often wonder what it would feel like to be a writer that has, a clear set of goals for what happens, what they're trying to achieve with their work and things like that. And I really don't. I am somebody who writes easily from a case of sort of indignant anger from time to time. I'm very much somebody who looks at a problem happening in the present and tries to find antecedents of that in the past. Because again, I'm somebody who likes to help people understand the way that power works. And there's often through lines in the past that can better explain these really complicated forces. So I'm more comfortable calling myself a historian, a chronicler. There's a really, I don't know who said this. It might be one of the classics, but somebody made a correction and said that being a historian is basically like being an accountant, that basically you're a debt collector.
Wow.
You're kind of keeping this balance sheet and keeping track of what is owed. And I certainly think that I am attracted to that side of the profession, the debt collecting.
And not letting things get forgotten.
Right. Yeah. Because I do have, very specific thoughts about remembering and forgetting and that sense of the past and sort of where these ideas are often framed as being forgotten. It's really kind of an intentional process to sort of crowd those out of the narrative, because they do bring a fair amount of discomfort and feelings of being unsettled with them. So all that though, that is to say, all that fits really happily under the umbrella of being a public historian for me. And so that's what I call myself. I was really fortunate to be trained by some wonderful people who sat me down and in my first initial studies made me read, intellectual books about power and memory and forgetting and all these things that would, kind of sustain my interest in history for the next decade. So my version of public history is, again, engaging with those big ideas, chronicling the past, and helping the public, understand the way that the world around them works and how the past is used in their everyday lives.
Right. Well, you certainly helped me understand a little bit, and we've had some conversation about perhaps doing some more collaboration as this church has its 100th anniversary of this building. So it kind of goes back to that same era of 1924. And we didn't even talk about several other things that are in the book that I think would be really helpful, and I'd encourage people to go look at, which are as the efforts in, was it 1916 for Charlottesville to try to create segregated
the zoning,
unofficially segregated.
A huge impact on the modern development of Charlottesville is the racist covenants and zoning laws and battles for public space that happened even earlier than 1924.
Right. That, and then the two state laws that were passed in 1924 too that relate to this eugenics conversation too. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. And thanks for giving me a little time to talk with you. Is there any, you want to give any information to anybody if they want to find out more or follow you in some way?
I have an easy name, Elizabeth Catte. Most of my social media handles are the same. My website is just elizabethcatte.com.
As long as you spell cat with a C-A-T-T-E.
And anybody who wants to track me down can do so easily. My publisher is Belt Publishing for both my books, but my writing is in the usual places that books are sold as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the time, and look forward to talking to you again.